Good morning.
Good morning, Steve. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Very good.
Good morning, John.
Good morning.
Hey, Dad. Hey, Mom. How are you? How's Rhode Island today?
Okay.
Hot, humid.
Well,
Good morning.
good morning, Carol. Yeah, it's hot and humid here. It's
Good
been
morning. Good morning.
appropriately vile for Tisha B'Av. Russell, where are you?
Uh,
Serengeti?
no. I'm in an elephant preserve in Sri Lanka.
Cool.
Ooh. I was supposed to go there in April.
It's
And
an,
guess where I didn't go?
it's an amazing trip. I was
Um,
supposed to go to Israel in April. And guess where I
Ugh.
didn't go?
All of these canceled plans.
I would probably have been in California.
It's just as scary.
Welcome, everyone. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hey, Gail. Nice to see you. Hello. Welcome. Grateful that you're here. Thank you to everyone who joined our Tisha B'Av observance last evening. Today is, in fact, the 9th of Av, the most emotionally and politically challenged or challenging day on the Jewish calendar, a day of mourning, traditionally observed as a day of fasting, though I would caution that if you are choosing to fast, you must still pay attention to your health, particularly your hydration. So just be safe, everyone. Most years I choose not to fast on the 9th of Av. It's kind of a personal relationship with this holiday, I would say, is ambivalent. I'm welcoming more people into the Zoom. I want to begin this class and every class after with a gentle reminder, though I think you've all figured this out, that because the class is being recorded, that means that if you choose to show yourself on screen at any point, it is possible that you will be seen online. And yeah, so you just want to, you can either signal that you don't want to be seen at all by turning off your video camera, or you can dress for the occasion.
You could be outed as a Mishnah macher.
Exactly. If that's the worst that ever happens to you, I'd say you're doing pretty okay. Whoa. I have some feedback. In a moment, I'm going to mute the class. Gain the ability to, wow. Okay, here we go. Muting. I have now muted all of you. You retain the ability to unmute yourself. And in fact, for whatever reason, Zoom changed the format so that I cannot unmute you. I can merely tell you to unmute yourself. So at any point, if you want to make a comment, you can either enter your question or comment into the chat window using the chat interface at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or you can open the participants window. That's the little icon at the bottom of your Zoom window if you're on a laptop, or maybe it's at the top if you're on a tablet. That looks like two little bobbleheads. And when you tap the participants window, a roster of who's in the class comes up on the right-hand side of the screen. And then there's an interface that allows you to raise a digital hand. It looks like a little blue hand like this. You can raise your hand that way. Because we have so many participants, I can't see all of you at once on screen. It means that I can't see your physical hand being raised, but I can see your digital hand. So welcome. We're going to get started with our long-form sequential inquiry into Mishnah, the building blocks of Jewish life. Once again, our class is being recorded, so please be advised if you choose to show yourself on camera. Also, the class will be archived online, and the link made available to all of you, so you can send it to all of your friends or enemies and invite them to spend some quality time learning Mishnah with me and with all of you. Join me as we say a blessing for the immersion in sacred words. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And off we go. We are now, I would say, more than ankle deep into Mishna Berakhot, chapter 1, which is the very first chapter in the Mishnah, part of a larger order or seder called Ziraim, which means seeds. One of the questions we have not yet explored and which we will not get to today, so you're going to have to just kind of keep this question tucked away in the back corner, the back recesses of your mind until we finally get around to asking it again, is what is an entire chapter on blessings, brachot in Hebrew, doing as the frontispiece of an order that purports to be about agriculture, an order called Ziraim, seeds. And indeed, the entire rest, and we will get to this, the rest of this order is in fact about planting and harvesting and what have you. But this first tractate, or masechet in Hebrew, brachot, is about blessings. So what is the connection between blessings and seeds? That's a longer form homework assignment, and I'm sure that you will apply good thought to it as we go. I just like to tuck that away as a little bit of a teaser. We have been studying specifically the first few mishnayot. We got into the middle of Mishnah 4. So just in terms of the hierarchy of the structure of Mishnah, the whole 6-volume set is called the Mishnah. Each of the 6 volumes is called an order, or in Hebrew a seder. Each seder is subdivided into tractates. Each tractate is called a masechet, plural masechtot. So we have the Mishnah, sedarim or seders, masechtot or tractates, and then each tractate is subdivided into individual paragraphs or teachings. Each of those paragraphs or teachings is called a Mishnah, sometimes with a lowercase m to distinguish it from the capital M, the Mishnah, which is the whole work. Mishnah, of course, a word that means to teach, but I'll remind you something I said at the first class, which we will need to access today. This is not for distant recall in the future. The word Mishnah is a particular kind of teaching. It's the same root as a word we will encounter and have been encountering in our studies from the middle of the Shema, or the Ve'ahavta paragraph. Vishinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam. Teach them faithfully to your children and speak of them in your home and on your way, when you lie down and when you rise up. That core line from the paragraph in the Shema that we sometimes call the Ve'ahavta, the thou shalt love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and might paragraph. Which, by the way, this is really the universe speaking in unison today. That's this week's Torah portion. This week's Torah portion in the regular cycle of Parshiot. Come back on Saturday morning at 9:30. I'll be leading Torah study on the Parsha called Va'et Hanan, which is from Deuteronomy 3 to the end of Deuteronomy, or the middle of Deuteronomy 7. It's a set of just about 4 chapters of Torah from the book of Deuteronomy that includes the Shema Ve'ahavta passage. So we're really studying Torah today. Anytime we recite Shema, as we learned last week, it is as if we are studying Torah, because we are studying Torah. It's taken directly from the Torah. Vishinantam, teach them faithfully, is a word that derives from the Hebrew word for your tooth, which in Hebrew is a shen, shin nun. Shen is a tooth. Vishinantam literally means to bite down or make an impression, like when you bite into that pink goo at the dentist's office so they can make an impression, a mold of your teeth, something permanent, right? You affix your teeth into the mold and you're left with a permanent impression. So that's the modality of teaching. And it is important to understand that this particular inflection, this particular word for teaching, conveys the way in which Mishnah and Torah and prayer were all learned in antiquity, which is through repetition and memorization. The baseline assumption of Mishnah is that only a small percentage of the population would have the qualification, the literacy, to read and study the text as a written document. the vast majority of the Jewish people had to learn all the jots and tittles of Jewish life through repetition and memorization, even the prayer book. And so when the Mishnah goes on to say that something is a teaching, what it really means is this was intended to be communicated orally. This also explains, I think, the kind of the literary dynamics of the Mishnah itself. It is clearly written as a book intended for easy memorization. It speaks in short, logical, simple Hebrew phrases with a kind of recursive logic. There's a lot of internal repetition, and we'll pay attention to those dynamics as well. But without delay, let us proceed into Mishnah itself. Now, I'm going to be doing a bunch of screen sharing today, and despite my continued practice in this medium, of necessity, of course, I continue to feel totally inept. So here we go. We're going to look at Mishna Berakhot, chapter 1, section 4, which is right where we left off last time. So let me bring that up on the screen, please. And I see we have a couple of other people that I'm just admitting in batches to the Zoom, so I'm multitasking here. Here we go. So as we look at Mishnah chapter 1, section, or Mishnah number 4, we got about halfway through this paragraph, and it's fairly straightforward. What is being discussed here is the structure of the section of the service called Shema Berakhot. We talked about that last week, the Shema and its blessings, or I like the poetry of the Shema and her blessings. The Shema is a long-form anthology of Torah passages, I'll say more on that in a minute, surrounded by blessings. So the Shema, I described it as like this little jewel sitting on a cushion, and the cushion are all these blessings that surround it, but that also prepare the reader for the Shema and acknowledge the meaning of the Shema in a larger context of God as creator, God as revealer, the one who brings Torah into the world, revealed as it were at Sinai, but also revealed every time we have an encounter with Torah, namely right now, or more to the point, anytime we daven, anytime we say the Shema, we're having an encounter with Torah, and therefore God's word gets re-revealed. Everything that happened in the past in Judaism happens right now. I'll say it again because that's a kind of a bold claim. Anything that we acknowledge having happened in the past as part of our history or our memory also happens right now. So we talked about this last week in light of, for instance, creation. We praise God as creator not only for the primordial creation, but also for the fact that the sun rose this morning. We praise God as the revealer of Torah, not only at Sinai in the distant past, but also anytime we say the Shema, or indeed anytime we study Torah together, God's word gets revealed anew. And we praise God as the redeemer of the Jewish people, not only at the exodus from Egypt in our distant past, but also anytime the experience of human freedom is brought to bear on our mission in the world. And more to the point, for a Jewish people who wrote these texts while subjugated under the Roman Empire, the idea of an ongoing redemption or even a future redemption for the Jewish people was, I would say, a subversive but persistent message of our faith. That yes, we are living in subjugated conditions now, but God is going to redeem us, which would necessitate overthrowing the Roman Empire. And so there's something seditious about our texts as well, something revolutionary about them, but it's coded, so if you're a Roman censor, it will pass your notice. Okay, so we're in the middle of this paragraph here, and it says, in the morning, he recites, one who is reciting the Shema, recites two blessings before it and one after it. And we talked about those. There's the blessing for creation in the morning, which is Ahava Rabbah, followed by the prayer, there's the blessing for creation, which is Yotzer Or, Uvorei Choshech, Oseh Shalom, Uvorei Atakol, praise God, creator of all the heavenly lights. Then there's the paragraph Ahava Rabbah, with a great love you have loved the Jewish people, bestowing Torah and mitzvot, laws and precepts have you given us. Therefore, O God, when we lie down and when we rise up, we shall meditate on your laws and rejoice in your Torah. If these words sound familiar, it's because we daven them. Then the Shema, we're going to look at the Shema. And then it says, in the morning, you say one, oops, I always do this. I touch the screen and then it screws it up. Sorry. In the morning, you say one blessing after it. So in the morning, that's the prayer that includes Micha Mocha, the redemption prayer, as Bob Marley would call it, redemption song. And then in the evening, you have the same two basic blessings before it, though the wording is slightly changed. Then you have Shema, and then you have two blessings afterward. You have first the blessing for redemption that includes Micha Mocha, and you add Hashkivenu, the blessing that means cause us to lie down, O God, at night. On the Sabbath, on Shabbat, it doesn't say this here in the Mishnah, but on Shabbat you add Vishamru. The people of Israel shall observe the Sabbath, keeping Shabbat for all time. Don't worry about that. This is what we're talking about is weekday. We're not talking about any inserts for Shabbat, which in many a prayer book, by the way, like on the high holidays, you know how the Shabbat inserts come up in red print to let you know. This year, by the way, Rosh Hashanah starts on a Friday night, September 18th, 7 weeks from now, in case you are getting anxious like I am. Rosh Hashanah begins on Shabbat, so we'll be doing all of what my friend Roger Weisberg likes to call the Szechuan menu. We'll be doing the Szechuan selections for the high holidays, all the stuff in red print, like the red hot, okay, never mind. If you get it, you get it. So we'll be doing the Szechuan menu on the high holidays this year, at least on Rosh Hashanah for Shabbat. What I want to do is show you the traditional Shema so that you understand that the Shema itself is a complicated paragraph. So did that screen come up? Did my screen successfully transfer? Good. Okay, I see a few thumbs up, which is all I needed to not feel like I screwed things up. So this is, as you can see from the Chabad website, the Shema in the original Hebrew. And it gives you like your stage directions, cover you eyes with you right hand and say, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, and then recite the following verse in an undertone, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. I'll tell you in a minute why you should recite it in an undertone, even though most Reform Jews do not. And then you can see, so you got Shema at the top, Baruch Shem, and I know a lot of us don't read Hebrew, but just bear with me, I'm going to just do some pointing with my cursor. This is Ve'ahavta, that's the first paragraph of the Shema, okay? Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, that whole paragraph, it goes to here, Al mezuzot beitecha uvihisharecha, inscribe them on the doorposts of your house, the mezuzot, the mezuzahs, beitecha of your house, uvisharecha, and on your gates. That's here. That's paragraph 1. Paragraph 2 is not traditionally recited in Reform circles, so it may not be familiar to you. But in an Orthodox setting, this is the second long paragraph of the Shema. It starts off with the words V'haya im shamoa tishmeu, which means, and if you do listen to the words, to the mitzvot that I am commanding you this day, that is to love Adonai your God and serve God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might, then I shall bestow dew upon your land in its season, and it will cause your crops to grow, and so forth. And then it goes on to say, but if you do not observe God's mitzvot, if you do not heed God's law, God will cause your crops to wither and die. Okay, that's the second paragraph. And because of its theology, because it posits that if you obey God's law, all is well, you will prosper. And if you do not, woe betide the one who does not heed God's mitzvot. I saw a question in the chat box that I'll come to in a minute. This now is the third paragraph of the Shema. And now we've jumped yet again. This is actually from the book of Numbers. So the Shema is a patchwork quilt of 3 separate biblical paragraphs. One from Deuteronomy chapter 6, one from Deuteronomy chapter I forget, but it's like later on in the book, and one from Numbers chapter 29. And the fact that I forget the exact chapter and verse citation for the middle paragraph is indicative of the fact that I don't daven it. like a good Reformed Jew, I've never davened v'hayayim Shema. Not true, I shouldn't say never. I've been to plenty of Orthodox services where we daven it, but it's not part of the Reform movement's custom. We cut that paragraph. And then there's a final paragraph, which also Reform Jews typically do not recite, that starts like this. Vayomer, I'm looking at this big Vayomer, Adonai el Moshe lemor, God said to Moses, saying, Daber el bnei Yisrael, speak to the Israelite people, ve'amarta alehem, and tell them, ve'asu lahem tzitzit al kanfei vigdehem ledorotam, that they must affix tzitzit, or fringes, to the corners of their garments in perpetuity. These guys, right? So you got to attach your tzitzit, or your tassels, to your garments. Jewish people continue to do this either by wearing a talit or by actually affixing fringes to their undergarment. And it goes on to talk about the tzitzit, which we talked about last week. You will recall the tzitzit with its ancient blue thread being the way that you can, it's like your sundial before the sun is fully up. If you can tell the difference between blue and white or blue and green using that blue thread in your tzitzit, then it's time to daven. And it goes on to the passage we do know, starting right here. So it talks about the blue thread, and then starting right here where my cursor is flashing, Lema'an tizkeru va'asitem et kol mitzvotai. Therefore, all of this comes so that you might remember and do all of my mitzvot et kol mitzvotai, v'hitem kedoshim le'elohechem, and be holy unto your God. Ani Adonai Elohechem, I am Adonai your God. Asher hotzeti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, lihiyot lachem le'elohim, to be your God. Ani Adonai Elohechem, I am Adonai your God. That is the last part of the Ve'ahavta that we all recite. Reform Jews, conservative Orthodox, any Jew says Lema'an tizkeru. But all this intermediary stuff about the rains and the crops, even into the paragraph about the tzitzit, Reform Jews traditionally have removed that from the liturgy, but we pick up at the end with Lema'an tizkeru. So the Shema, in case you didn't realize it, is not just one line. When the Mishnah talks about the Shema, it's talking about this 3-paragraph anthology. I promised I'd come back to this, then I'm going to take the questions in the chat window, and I'll open up for a brief discussion. You notice how it says, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, which you're supposed to recite with your eyes covered. That's just a Jewish tradition that you would cover your eyes so that you can focus on the sense of hearing. Shema, hear, O Israel, right? It amplifies your hearing if you don't have the distraction of the visuals. The part I wanted to come back to was recite the following verse in an undertone, meaning the famous Baruch Shem Kivod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. Now, why would you have to whisper that verse? The answer is that it's not part of the Shema in the Torah. Baruch Shem Kivod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. Baruch is a giveaway that this is rabbinic, not biblical, right? The rabbis use the word Baruch to praise God. The Bible does not, in general. So Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed is a rabbinic affirmation of the Shema. For one to recite the Shema is to affirm one's faith in God. It is the central, and really in Judaism, the only creed that the Jew is obligated to profess. Right? We are not, by and large, a creedal or a doctrinal religion in the sense that the essence of Jewish faith is to make a declaration of our faith. The essence of Jewish faith is to accept the responsibility for performing mitzvot. That's what it is to be Jewish. In a nutshell, somebody says, what does it mean to be Jewish? It means that I accept the responsibility for mitzvot in my life. However, the Shema is the exception that proves this rule. The Shema begins with the one central declaration of faith. Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. And in the Torah, that's Deuteronomy chapter 6:4. And then chapter 6, verse 5 is Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. This line, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, is a rabbinic insert that basically says, praise God and praise God's name. That's exactly what it says. Bless God and bless God's name, which is what the whole congregation says after the reader or the prayer leader says Shema Yisrael. You have to insert this. It's such an important statement, Shema Yisrael, that it deserves an amen. Like a black preacher would say, can I get an amen? That's Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. Only, unlike in the black church, can I get an amen in Judaism is done in a whisper. Because it's an acknowledgement that you are interrupting the Torah reading to say, can I get an amen? You're interrupting Shema, which should flow directly from Echad into Ve'ahavta, as it appears in this week's Torah portion, to say, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, Yea God. All right, that's all it is. And that's why in an Orthodox setting, it is a faux pas to sing Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad with the whole congregation, and then in full voice to go Baruch Shem Kavod, like we do in Reformed synagogue. In Reformed services, we sing Baruch Shem loud and proud. If you go to a conservative or Orthodox shul, you'll notice that everybody gets really quiet on Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. So that's like a pro tip. The next time you're davening in a conservative and Orthodox setting, chill out on Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. Just take it easy. The people aren't used to hearing you shout that line. It's traditionally recited in an undertone. So that's a little bit on the architecture of Shema itself. And now the questions in the chat box. One, is Yismachu also one of those prayers for the weekdays? No, to the contrary. Yismachu, Yismechu v'malachutecha, shomre, 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 shahabat. Listen to the words of Yismechu. They shall rejoice in your kingdom, all those who observe Shabbat. That's the line. So Yismechu is only a Shabbat insert. Yismechu is part of a longer conversation on the way in which the liturgy changes for Shabbat. Question in the chat box. Are these prayers we recite at specific times for a minyan or for an individual? Excellent. So the Shema, unlike the Amida, unlike the Tefillah, the central prayers of the service, which we haven't gotten to yet, the Shema is recited either in a minyan in public or privately. Hence the whole idea of a bedtime Shema or a morning Shema. Remember, we've been talking for the first three mishnayot, the first three mishnas of this Masechet, this chapter, Berachot, are all about when is it okay to say the Shema in the evening and when in the morning. And the assumption is that you're doing it by yourself. So the Shema is a prayer that does not require a minyan. The Tefillah, the Avot, the Imahot, all the other big prayers, the ones where you're standing during the service. I know we stand for Shema, but that's another Reform thing. You're going to learn a lot about how Reform Judaism changed our prayer modalities by taking this class. The Tefillah is always done in a minyan. If you don't have a minyan, you can't do it. Shema you can do with just one person by him or herself. Why is there a star above the Tav in the third row? Oh, I have no, it's above the Lamed here, I guess, or here. I don't know what these stars, there are a whole bunch of them. I have no idea what those are for. That's really interesting. I've never seen that before. Okay, I've got homework to do. I literally no idea. I wouldn't have even noticed it. But thank you for calling my attention to it. I think that was Diane who wrote that comment. Fascinating. From a member of the class to me, tradition dictates the one kisses the tzitzit at those 3 times when it is mentioned, all as a remembrance. Correct. So if you are davening the passage about the tzitzit down here, this is the word tzitzit where my cursor is flashing. It comes up here, here, and here. And traditionally, you're wearing your talis at a morning service, and you would kiss the tzitzit each time you say the word tzitzit. There are all sorts of fun little rituals and traditions that Jewish people do. It can really make you crazy, though. Other comments or questions in the chat window. Yeah, the asterisk or the stars above several characters in this passage. That's my homework. Question from my dad. What regarding the sacred words recited by the Kohanim at the temple on the high holidays? No, you're going to have to clarify that question, Dad.
I was thinking about that's where the line after the Shema comes. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchut.
Correct. Yes,
It's
exactly.
only supposed to be the high priest who said that word.
That's right. Thank you. Okay, so yes, thank you. You've further elucidated why we whisper it instead of shouting it in Jewish tradition. Right. On the high holidays, so the origin of the custom, exactly right. The origin of the custom for Baruch Shem is that was what the priests were all supposed to have fallen on their faces, prostrated themselves, and exclaimed when the high priest in the innermost chamber of the tabernacle, the Kodesh HaKodashim, or the Holy of Holies, pronounced the name of Adonai in its full, long-form, ineffable pronunciation. All the priests, all the Kohanim fell on their faces and prostrated themselves and exclaimed, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Vayed. But because there is no temple, and because the priesthood has been turned into merely a ceremonial function, we common Israelites should only whisper it. Yes. Wonderful. Excellent. Good job, folks. Okay, so now you've learned a lot about Shema. Now we can actually go back to our Mishnah. So that's basically how Shema is placed in the service. 3 paragraphs mushed together with clear paragraph breaks, surrounded by a couple of blessings before and either 1 or 2 blessings afterward, depending on the time of day, either morning or evening when you recite Shema. And unlike the Amidah or the Tefillah, again, the central prayers of the service, Shema is recited only twice a day, morning and evening. And you know that because of exactly what the passage itself tells us. Speak of them in your home and on your way, when you lie down and when you rise up. And you remember from last week, there was even a conversation in the Mishnah about how literally you should take lie down and rise up. Rabbi Tarfon decided it would be a great idea to follow Beit Shammai and lie down in the middle of the road, and he was molested by bandits. To which Hillel would have said, yeah, idiot. Don't actually lie down. You just do it at the time of day when one customarily lies down and when one rises up. And this is going to become a common dynamic in the Mishnah. How literally or figuratively are we to take what the Bible tells us? You're going to see it again today. So let's read on. Where they, meaning the sages, the anonymous sages who seem to have conveyed this oral tradition to the rabbis who actually wrote and compiled the Mishnah, where they said that a long one should be said, he may not say a short one. Where they said a short one, he may not say a long one. Or what the heck are they talking about? Well, you got to remember what the antecedents are here. In the morning, back to the beginning of the Mishnah, he, meaning the one who's saying the Shema, the supplicant, recites 2 blessings before it, meaning the Shema, and 1 after it. In the evening, 2 before it and 2 after it, 1 long and 1 short. So we have here the rabbis telling us that we have different kinds of blessings in our prayer book. Some of them are long and some are short. Let's talk about what that means for a minute. What is a long blessing and what is a short blessing? Well, there's actually a debate that never gets resolved. Some say that a long blessing is designated simply by its length. In other words, you can just tell that you're reading a long blessing because it's long. And a short blessing is something like Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. 1 line, bless God who brings forth bread from the earth. Whereas this blessing, which is the Ma'ariv blessing, it's the blessing that comes first in the Shema section. It's right after Baruch Hu. It acknowledges God, the creator of evening. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bidvaro ma'ariv aravim b'chochma poteach she'arim uvitvuna meshaneh itim umachal. You see, it's a very long prayer. So some rabbis say this is a long blessing because it's not just 1 line. It's a whole paragraph. Maimonides is of a different opinion. Maimonides' opinion is that the difference between a long blessing and a short blessing is whether or not you start and end with Baruch atah Adonai. Let me explain. This blessing according to Maimonides, is a long blessing. Notice how this blessing starts with the words Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam. That's the blessing formula. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe. And notice how this blessing also ends with the same formula. Right here, Baruch Atah Adonai HaMa'ariv Aravim. In other words, it's the kind of writing that says, let me announce the theme of the prayer. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, Asher Bidvaro Ma'ariv Aravim, who with his word brings on the evening. That's what that means. And then all this praise to God, many, 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 many lines in the paragraph. And then finally at the end, there's a statement, Baruch Atah Adonai HaMa'ariv Aravim. Blessed are you, Adonai, who brings on the evening. In other words, we announce our theme. We expatiate at some length, we go on, we expound our theme, and then at the end, same formula, we recap our theme. This last line of a long-form prayer is what makes it a long-form prayer, according to Maimonides. In other words, Maimonides says long for a blessing means it starts with Baruch Atah Adonai, and it ends with Baruch Atah Adonai, and everything in between. Let me give you an example of one that you know well. The Friday night Kiddush. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Borei Pri Hagafen. That's a short form blessing. That is not a Kiddush, by the way. That just means thank you, God, for grapes. Thank you for the creator of the fruit of the vine. But then it goes on, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kidshanu B'mitzvotav V'ratzavanu. If you've ever been to a Friday night service, you know this. The musical setting, by the way, by the great 19th century German composer Louis Lewandowski. Rishabat Kodsho B'Ahava Uvratzon. It's a very long paragraph, lots and lots of singing. And then finally at the end, Baruch Atah Adonai Mekadesh HaShabbat. Blessed are you, Adonai, who sanctifies the Sabbath. So the Friday night Kiddush is a long-form blessing, not only because it is long, which is a subjective evaluation, but according to Maimonides, it meets the definition of long because it starts with Baruch Atah Adonai and it ends with Baruch Atah Adonai. And that ending line is the most important line in any blessing. So here's another pro tip. If you are scanning a prayer book and you want to figure out what is this blessing about, don't read the whole blessing. Skip to the last line. Skip to the line that says Baruch Atah Adonai, and then read what comes after that, and then you know what the prayer is about. Because it's always a recap. It's always, and the moral of the story is, and the meaning of this prayer has been, and because these prayers can get very long. But in Jewish tradition, the last line is the most important, and it is called a chatima, which is a word that means to seal or sign, like Stevie Wonder, sign, seal, delivered, okay? Chatima, the last line of the prayer is the chatima. This line, the most important line, blessed are you, Adonai, who brings on the evening. And now that you know that, you'll really have a much easier time making your way through the prayer book. So it is the generally accepted Maimonidean definition that a long blessing means you start and end with Baruch Atah Adonai, and a short form blessing is anything that doesn't fit that formula, anything that only says Baruch Atah Adonai once. Comment or question from Ellen: what determines when you bow on saying Baruch? It's really complicated, so I'm going to just answer briefly. The word Baruch, which we understand to mean bless. So here's a little trivia question. The word Mishnah comes from Vishinantam, comes from the tooth, Shen. Okay, so teaching is from your teeth, according to the Mishnah, or according to Vishinantam. What part of the body is associated with the word Baruch? What part of the body is associated with blessing God? Baruch is directly related to, yes, Joanne got it. She put it in the chat box.
The knee.
The knee. Baruch comes from the Hebrew word berech, which is the word for your knees. And that is because to bless God is to supplicate or submit, right? It's the same, by the way, as, this is a provocative statement, but it's the same as the meaning of the word Islam. Islam means submission. One supplicates or submits oneself to the yoke, Y-O-K-E, not Y-O-L-K, the yoke of a higher authority. That is the meaning of Islam. That is also the meaning of Baruch. By blessing God, you are bowing down. You bend the knee. You acknowledge that God is the sovereign and you're not. Okay, so that is the meaning of Baruch. So there are many times in a prayer service when it is customary to actually, it's like you kiss the tzitzit when you read the word tzitzit. You bend the knee when you say the word Baruch. When you say in Aleinu, umishtachavim ukorim, which means we bend the knees and bow at the waist, guess what you do while facing the ark? You bend your knees and bow at the waist. So it's not just a little knee bend, it's a full bow at the waist. So there are all sorts of ritual choreography that Jewish people do to reinforce the meaning of the prayers. And therefore, these are more custom than law. You don't bow every time the word Baruch is said. You basically bow for the first Baruch that the congregant recites or repeats for any rubric of the service. I'm sorry, I wish I could say it more compactly than that. But you bow for the first time when the reader or the service leader says, Baruch et Adonai hamivorach. He is saying, hey, Jewish people, are you ready to bow? Are you ready to pray? And for the first time you bow in the service, it's Baruch Adonai hamivorach leolam va'ed. Blessed be God and blessed be the name of God. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam. That's when you bow, when you respond. By the way, don't bow along with the service leader. This is one of Alan's bugaboos. I don't blame you, Alan. I get the same way. The service leader says, Baruch et Adonai hamvorach. The service leader can bow all he or she likes at that moment. The supplicant, that's you, the responder, the one who is praying along with the service leader, then you bow on Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto, or Baruch et Adonai hamvorach, Baruch Adonai hamvorach le'olam va'ed. That's when you bow. You bow on your Baruch. Then you don't bow again for a long time. You don't bow on Baruch Shem Kavod. You don't bow again until the Avot V'Imahot. That's the next time you bow. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu ve'imotenu. Because it's the first prayer in a new section of the service. Baruch is the Shema section of the service. The Amida is the next section of the service. And lo and behold, you don't bow again until Aleinu. So basically, unless you're going to like a Musaf service or a really long service, you basically have three main chances to bow. If you really want to get complicated, yes, there are other places in the tefillah where it's traditional to bow, but I'm not going to get into that now. Okay, and neither is the Mishnah. Okay, so what we have here is a long-form blessing. Starts with Baruch Atah Adonai, ends with a chatima or a signature, a seal, signed, seal, delivered, Baruch Atah Adonai. That's how you know it's long according to Maimonides. And all the rabbis are saying here is that if what the prayer book prescribes is a long one, say the long blessing. If it gives you a short blessing, say the short blessing. This is important because the assumption is you don't have the prayer book in front of you. All of these rules were so that you would know how to daven from memory. That's the whole point. That's really the only point. You have to assume that they're giving you all of these guidelines for how to pray because the average person didn't have a written siddur in front of him. In fact, much of this was conveyed before anything was written down by way of a prayer book. All right, and then vice versa, where they said a short one, he may not say a long one, so don't sub a short for a long, or vice versa. Where they said to conclude, and the word for conclude, I'm highlighting it here with my little hand, lachtom, chatima, to make a signature, to seal the blessing. Where they said to conclude with a blessing, he is not permitted to not conclude, or I don't like split infinitives, even though Merriam-Webster says they're okay now, which is really a challenge for me. So if you're supposed to end with a Baruch Atah Adonai, then you have to do it that way. And where they said to not conclude or not to conclude with a blessing, he may not conclude. And in other words, there are rules and regulations and you have to follow them. Okay. Wow. That's a lot, but we've made it through Mishnah 4, and 5 is actually really pretty straightforward. So we're going to get through 5, and then we'll take a lot of questions. they mention the exodus from Egypt at night. They meaning the Jewish people. I don't love this translation. I would just say one mentions the exodus from Egypt at night. And here you notice that the word for mention is mazkirin. You recall. It's from zecher or zikaron or yizkor, same root. In fact, I have a yizkor candle lit behind me today in commemoration of Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which is today. So zecher. Sometimes you even have the word zecher written on this. This is not what is inscribed on mine. In calligraphy, it says something else. But in any case. Mazkirin Yitziat Mitzrayim Ba'leilot. You are supposed to recall the exodus from Egypt in the evening. We know this, by the way. I told you, after every Shema, there's a Micha Mocha. And when do you say the Shema? You say it when you lie down and when you rise up, which we now know means nighttime and morning. Pretty straightforward. Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, "Behold, I am almost a 70-year-old man," which would have been really old back then, "and I have not succeeded in understanding why the exodus from Egypt should be mentioned at night until Ben Zoma explained it from a verse in Deuteronomy 16:3. Now, how many of you regard this passage with a measure of familiarity? All right, show of hands. Anyone know where you've heard it before?
The Haggadah.
This is in the Haggadah. This is from the famous rabbis with difficult to pronounce names spending all night leading the Passover ritual in Bnei Barak. It tells us that there were all of these rabbis with all the funny names, Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Ben Zoma. All these dudes were having their Passover Seder at night. And Elazar ben Azariah pipes up and says, "Behold, I am almost 70 years old. I'm getting up there, and I never understood why you're supposed to say the exodus from Egypt at night." Now, Joanne in the chat window commented, "Hey, wait a minute, didn't they leave Egypt at night in haste?" Yeah, so maybe that actually is the reason why one recites the exodus from Egypt at night, because it corresponds to the time when the Israelites went free from Egypt. We know that the 10th plague struck in the middle of the night, and that was their cue to get out of Dodge. But if we keep reading, we will notice that the Mishnah proposes a different reason. So why do we say the exodus from Egypt at night? And by the way, the exodus from Egypt is part of the Shema, the last paragraph. L'man tizkeru v'asitem et kol mitzvotai, so that you might remember, there's that word again, tizkeru, v'asitem et kol mitzvotai, v'item kedoshim le'elohechem, and be holy unto your God. Ahani Adonai Elohechem, I am Adonai your God. Asher hotzeiti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. There it is, right in the Shema. Lihiot lachem le'elohim, in order to be your God. Ani Adonai Elohechem, I am Adonai your God. So every time you say the Shema, there's a built-in reference to the exodus from Egypt, very last paragraph, very last line. But Elazar ben Azariah is saying, I'm an old guy and I've never figured this one out. But Ben Zoma gives him a midrash, a rabbinic explanation. He says, aha, there is a verse in Deuteronomy that says, you recall the exodus from Egypt in order that you may remember the day you left Egypt all the days of your life. The days of your life refers to just the days. All the days of your life refers to the nights. This is typical midrash. I can see Russell squinting, which means he does not like it because it's just so absurd. But Russell has to also be familiar with the theories of Derrida, who suggested that perhaps the orthodoxies of how we make meaning out of text are just that. They're a little too orthodox. So the rabbis have all sorts of hermeneutics or principles from which meaning can be derived from a text. I'm talking fancy talk, but let me try and break it down for you. According to the rabbis, if you want to tell people that they should remember Egypt all the days of their life, all you have to do is just say, remember Egypt for the days of your life. You don't need the word all. All is redundant. Okay, we know it's not. It's just the way people talk, but okay. they're really using it to set up a bigger point. The days of your life means just the days. All the days of your life refers to the nights. Remember how I said the rabbis have this penchant to read things hyper literally? That's exactly what they're doing here. When we say, you should remember this all the days of your life, we're not actually talking about when the sun is shining and when the sun is down. It's just an idiom. It's a figure of speech that means always. But the rabbis hyper-literalize it and say, no, the proof by saying the word all the days is that you should also do it at night. You can like it or not like it, but that doesn't really matter because that's how the rabbis are doing this passage. In other words, it's not up to you. It has nothing, whether or not you like it has nothing to bear on how the rabbis are constructing this midrash. Days of your life means just the days. All the days of your life means the nights as well. But you notice we have this tantalizing little additional coda, and that's exactly what this is. Think about a musical coda, where an additional statement is raised in order to provide an elevated sense of conclusion. And the sages say, so now you have an additional rabbinic teaching that is being cited. The days of your life refers not to when the sun is shining, but rather to your life in this world. But all the days of your life include the days of the Messiah. In Hebrew, kol yemei chayecha, all the days of your life, lehavi limot HaMashiach, which brings in the days of the Mashiach, the days of the Messiah. And then you're at the end of your first chapter of Mishnah. You finished Mishna Berakhot, chapter 1. And I just want to pay attention to what just happened at the end of the chapter. All of a sudden, we found ourselves thinking about the Messianic era. This is intentional. What the rabbis do is that they believe that a chapter of Mishnah should end on a note of salvation or comfort. Recall that the overarching condition under which these texts are being written, compiled, anthologized, and explicated is all subjugation by the Roman Empire and the early stages of Jewish diaspora. And above all, the rabbis are looking to encode into the writing of the Mishnah passages to provide hope for the reader. So there's an emotional thing happening here as well as an analytical thing. It's basically saying, above all, the reason we recite this passage is to remind ourselves of the ultimate messianic redemption. And the rabbis are going to keep coming back to this. Judaism is a highly messianic tradition. A lot of that has been subjugated, particularly by the last 200 years of Reform Judaism. So if you belong to a congregation such as ours, where Reform is quite literally our middle name, you may not be familiar with these dynamics that have so saturated rabbinic thought and therefore Judaism that they are inescapable. But if you're a Reform Jew, you actually they might have escaped your notice. We are a messianic tradition. Judaism has a forward-thinking, forward-looking trajectory that is all about moving from the world as it is to the world as it ought to be, transforming the universe from what we have to what it would look like under the rule of the unchallenged rule of God, an era announced by God's anointed one, the Mashiach or the Messiah. I'm going to pause here for questions, which you can ask either in the chat window or unmute yourself to comment or question. Congratulations, though. You've just finished your first chapter of Mishnah, and we still have time to start chapter 2. So thoughts, questions, comments? Okay. So let me comment here that the first chapter of Berachot is 5 sections long, and each of the sections is about how you say the Shema, right? It's in a way, it's about the mechanics of it. As we've seen, there's a lot of other stuff embedded in there. Somebody asked, what does Judaism say about the plagues or pandemics? Nope, I'm not taking that question. I love that question, but that is off topic. And by the way, I've taught on this subject. And I believe I've archived the lesson online. So I can make that available to the questioner. There's a passage in the Babylonian Talmud, Bava Kama 60b, which I taught on Erev Shavuot, which was May 28th. So exactly 2 months ago. which was about how you deal with a pandemic or a massive plague. And it's one of many, many passages. So that is a sermon for another Shabbos. Okay, so here we go into Mishna Berakhot, chapter 2, as you can see at the top of the page. And by the way, if you're using Sephara on your own, it's a really nice interface. You just click here, and you see you get the whole table of contents, and you can click here for a daily digest. Anyway, and then you just close that, and we're back to it. Okay, so Mishna Berakhot, chapter 2. I don't know why it skipped my page. Okay, so we've been talking about how you say the Shema. Now we're going to get into some dynamics that are not only about the mechanics of reciting the Shema. Let's read, and we will discover. I like to start in the Hebrew by way of making it a little bit more approachable for you, because it's really approachable Hebrew. I know if you know no Hebrew, it's still gobbledygook, but I'll do my best to make you feel unintimidated by Hebrew. Haya koreh vatorah. When one reads in the Torah, Vihigia Zeman HaMikra, and the time comes for the recitation, Im Kivein Libo, if he directs his heart, Yatsa, he has been released. Or what the hell does that mean? Let's unpack it. Let's see how they translate it. If one was reading in the Torah, the section of the Shema, okay, that's what's implied, and the time for its recital arrived, if he directed his heart to fulfill the mitzvah, he has fulfilled his obligation. But if not, he has not fulfilled his obligation. I'm not sure that's any more helpful to us. So I want to break this down into small chunks because it actually isn't as confusing as it sounds. Let's start with the scenario. The scenario is if one was reading in the Torah, the section of the Shema, when would that happen? Well, this week. Fascinatingly. This week, it's this week's Torah portion. I've told you that several times today. This is what we're going to be reading on Saturday morning at Torah study. If one was reading the section of the Shema, and it just so happened to be the same time of day when you are supposed to recite the Shema in your prayers, if you direct your heart to fulfill the mitzvah, you have fulfilled your obligation to recite the Shema. In other words, you're not reciting the Shema as prayer. You're reciting it as the Torah reading for the day. But if while reciting the Torah reading for the day, you are thinking, directing your heart literally means, it figuratively means your thoughts, not your emotions. All right, you are thinking about, I am chanting today's Torah portion, but what I'm really doing is fulfilling the mitzvah of reciting the Shema, then you have fulfilled your obligation. No further Shema needed from you. But if not, if you did not direct your heart to fulfill the mitzvah of reciting the Shema, then you have not fulfilled your obligation. I'll frame it as a question. What is the bigger takeaway from this extraordinary first line of chapter 2?
Intentionality means a lot when you're praying.
Yeah. For the first time, we've done 5 Mishnahs from chapter 1, but at no point did we talk about what is the supplicant thinking or feeling. We've only been talking about what is the supplicant obligated to do in order to fulfill the mitzvah of reciting the Shema. When does he have to say it? What time does he have to say it? What body posture should he have while he's saying it? What happens if what are the blessings surrounding it? It's all structural or mechanical. For the first time, we get to a fascinating and provocative statement that says, the way you are thinking about how you are saying it also matters with respect to the acceptability of the prayer in God's sight. So in other words, even if you are reading the Shema as part of a regular Torah reading and it's not part of your daily prayers, if you intend for it to be offered as prayer unto God, you have fulfilled your obligation to say the Shema for that day. It's a fascinating idea. Again, don't get so hung up on the Shema business. Get hung up on the idea that your intention may be just as important as the actual recital of the prayer. The recitation and the intention are twin dynamics equal in importance. Next, and we're going to come back to this a lot. The two words that inform any Jewish conversation about prayer are the following in Hebrew. Keva, which is kuf bet ayin. Keva means that which is fixed. It literally comes from a word that means to fix or affix. When you put a mezuzah on your door, you say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu. Blessed are you, Adonai our God, ruler of the universe, who makes our lives holy with mitzvot and commands us, likboa mezuzah, to affix a mezuzah to the doorpost of my house. Affix, likboa, keva, that which is fixed. So in prayer, you have that which is fixed. In other words, the script, right? A Haggadah, the prayer service for a Passover Seder. The keva is the Haggadah. The Haggadah is the script. It doesn't change. Yeah, you can get a fancy Reform Haggadah, you can get a Haggadah with pictures, but the script is the same. The other dynamic of Jewish prayer is called kavannah. What are you feeling? Kavannah means intention. What were you thinking about when you were praying? How was your heart aligned with the words on the page? And in order for Jewish prayer to be successful, and that of course is a subjective term, in order for Jewish prayer to be successful, it needs elements of both. It needs an element of fixity and an element of intentionality. We are not really of a tradition like Quakers or other spiritual disciplines where prayer is constituted of you saying whatever comes to your heart, right? In a friends meeting, that is to say the religion of the Quakers or the Friends, Society of Friends, you sit in silence with your co-worshipers until somebody is moved to stand up and testify. Testifying also is a big part of Pentecostal faith and Mormon faith. You just spill it, and that's your prayer. It's like all kavannah. And I'm exaggerating, of course. But in Judaism, there's a keva. You have to know the fixed structure and language of the prayer, but it is not necessarily the only thing that matters when you pray. Keva is the fixed. Kavannah is what the supplicant brings to the enterprise of praying. And I'm sure that, by the way, when I hear kvetches about the prayer book or the prayer service, it's usually about the way in which the extreme attention to keva in the Jewish tradition makes it hard for some supplicants to get kavannah, right? All of these Hebrew words and all of these, and when do I bow, and how many times can I say Shema, and am I supposed to be lying down in the middle of the road, and what about the bandits? All of that is keva, right? All of those questions. And if you are only focused on that, how do you actually have a meaningful prayer experience? On the other hand, we don't want to show up for a Shiva minyan and not know that everyone can say the same Kaddish together. Right? You need a keva for Judaism and for prayer in Judaism to function. A couple comments in the... so we have some great comments from David. Can we infer that the lack of intent, that is to say, doing prayer by rote, does not fulfill the obligation? That's a wonderful question. We're going to hold it in abeyance because we're going to get to it eventually. And the answer is maybe yes. Stephen Maskett writes, can we also infer that the part of the subsequent paragraphs that are not from Deuteronomy are not necessary to fulfill the obligation? No. Oh, that's really good. I see what Steve is asking. Because if you're reading in this week's Torah portion, you don't get the middle or last paragraphs of the Shema. You only get Deuteronomy 6:4 and following. So I think if I understand Steve correctly, that would imply that the passage about the tzitzi and the passage about the rain and the crops and God will punish you if you don't obey the mitzvot, but reward you if you do, none of that actually counts as obligatory. That is a reasonable inference, but I'm not sure it's one that the Mishnah itself will make. Michelle Braun writes, this looks like a rare challenge to mechanical requirement of the observance of mitzvot. Rarely does intent overcome action, except we would like to think so. Yeah, I think you're right. This is an interesting, I don't know if it's a challenge to it, but it deepens one's perspective that Judaism is a religion of mechanical or rote recitation. The Mishnah explicitly provides evidence that that is not a fair characterization of Judaism. And she continues, Once inside the actions, the world of tradition can be freeing for prayer. Yes, in discipline is greatest freedom, right? The Jewish way is that learn the building blocks of prayer, learn the way of mitzvot, pay attention to the details, do the things right and to the letter of the law, and then you can, within that discipline, experience true intention. Some people just don't buy that. They're like, I find my spiritual connection in a concert hall, on a yoga mat, on a hike in the mountains by a stream, and I don't need all of those words of the prayer book. They get in the way of my true prayer. That's fine. That's just not the perspective of the Mishnah. I'm not here to tell you how to have a personal, meaningful prayer life. I'm here to tell you how to read Mishnah. But yeah, these open up fascinating and very important Jewish conversations. Another comment. When I was growing up, my rabbi challenged, this is from Steve, challenged us to pray with kavannah, meaning with intention, but instructed us that it would come from repetition and just keep doing them, and from time to time one would experience kavannah. I love that. Larry Hoffman, I think, he talks about something called the art of public prayer, which is in fact the name of one of his most influential books. The art of public prayer. And at one point in that book, he says it's kind of like a ball player going up to bat. Sometimes you make contact with the ball, often you don't. Sometimes you get a single, and once, very, very infrequently, but once in a while you get a home run. But sometimes you just strike out. And the idea is you just keep coming up to the plate, you keep working on your swing, and you experience the flow of prayer, not as a kind of litmus test of how pious you are as a supplicant, but rather as an opportunity to connect. Connect with the ball. Don't swing for the fences. Maybe once in a while you'll hit a home run, but just as often you might strike out. I have found that metaphor very freeing in my own prayer, that I don't think it's worth beating oneself up if you have a highly distracted prayer experience and you just don't get into the bliss field when you're praying. I'm telling you as your rabbi, that doesn't happen to me all that often. I don't think that I have a better track record with successful kavannah in prayer any more than any other Jew in the pew. Once in a while, I feel like I'm really there. Often I'm like, oh my God, there were 6 emails before Shabbat that I forgot to write back to. And that's where my head is when I'm leading the congregation. And that's exactly what the rabbis are talking about in the next line. So let's look forward. So we're talking about kavannah. We're talking about intention. If one has not directed his heart, he has not fulfilled his obligation. In the breaks between sections, one may give greeting out of respect and return greeting. Let's just take that. Okay. We've seen that in the Shema itself, there are little breaks, but also there are breaks between sections of the liturgy. You really don't have to know where all the breaks are. Basically, it's just between paragraphs or small sections. Remember how last week and this week we recapped that the prayers that cushion the Shema, that surround the Shema, are on the themes of God as creator, God as revealer, God as redeemer. Each one of those subsections, whether it is made up of one prayer or 2, is a break, as opposed to the middle of the prayer. Okay, I think that this is fairly self-explanatory. There are breaks in between the prayers. In the middle of the prayer, there are no breaks. So suppose I'm davening, right? Let's suppose I'm just chanting, Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi chamocha. And Rick Jacobs walks into the sanctuary in the middle of Mi chamocha, all right? That happens, by the way, when you're a rabbi at WRT. You always have to be on your game because the president of the Reform movement might just walk into your services while you're leading them. So it's much better on Zoom, by the way. None of these distractions. But Rick Jacobs walks in while I'm leading Mi chamocha. And it says, in the breaks between sections, one may give greeting out of respect and return a greeting. So if Rick walks into the room, I should finish saying Mi chamocha, and then I can turn to him and say, Rabbi Jacobs, welcome, Shabbat Shalom. After that section, I should not go, mi kamocha. Rabbi Jacobs, how good to see you. Because then I've thrown off my own prayer. I've made it impossible for me to complete the keva. It's not good for my kavannah. It's not good for my intention. And Rick is not that important that I need to interrupt my prayer for him. But I am using him deliberately as an example. Because he's the kind of person who has, who walks into the room and who has my respect immediately. He was my boss once, but he's my Rav. He's my rabbi. So as a sign of respect, it would be proper for me to greet him. But this says, wait for a break in the service, will you? Like, you don't have to interrupt the prayer to greet Rick. And return a greeting. So suppose it's the middle of Micha Mocha, or it's right after Micha Mocha. It's a break between prayers. And Rabbi Jacobs not only walks in front of the bima, but he just kind of mumbles. He says, Shabbat Shalom. He says, Rabbi Blake, Shabbat Shalom. Then I can return the greeting, and I can say, and Shabbat Shalom to you, Rabbi Jacobs. In the middle of a section, one may give greeting out of fear and return it, according to Rabbi Meir, the words of Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir says, well, what would be the circumstance in which I actually could interrupt my prayer out of fear? This is fascinating, and there's no definitive answer, but I think that it could go something like this. I'm in the middle of leading Aleinu on the high holidays, and all of a sudden, an usher, a greeter, comes running up to the bima. This happened a couple years ago. Or my executive director, who usually is watching the security monitors and greeting members as they come into the sanctuary. Let's suppose that Eli runs up in the middle of my leading a big prayer on Rosh Hashanah. That is a signal to the rabbi, Houston, we have a problem, right? Okay, or somebody shouts from the pews that somebody on Yom Kippur has fainted. This happens. It happens like every other year because people shouldn't be fasting, and they do, or it's a hot day like today, and it's Tisha B'Av, and they just push themselves a little too hard. Out of fear, I should stop what I'm doing immediately to respond to that person. I can give a greeting. I can say, everything okay? I can stop, Aleinu l'shabech, hey, everything okay? And I can even return a greeting, according to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Judah says, in the middle, one may give greeting out of fear and return it out of respect. So he has this more lenient position that says, not only can I interrupt a prayer if I'm concerned, but also if Rabbi Jacobs walks into the room and I just want to show him some respect, I can salute him. I can even stop my prayer to return a greeting if I am greeted by my elder, my superior, my rabbi. And in the breaks, one may give a greeting out of respect and return a greeting to anyone. In between, if you're in between prayers, you can always stop what you're doing to say hi to somebody. Questions or thoughts on Berachot too? There's a lot happening here, but it's actually not particularly deep. Okay. And so we get to move on. So we've now covered a few, but we're adding to the recipe, right? We're now seasoning the recipe of how you pray in Jewish tradition by saying, wait a minute, folks. It's not just the words on the page. It's not just the order of the prayers. First, it's what are you feeling when you are praying? What is your intention? And secondly, what do you do about the fact that in Judaism, prayer is a public act? It is done in community. So how much schmooze time is there in the middle of prayers? Now, how many of you grew up in an Orthodox setting? Or even conservative setting? Or let me put it this way. How many of you are accustomed to a Jewish prayer setting where there's a lot of side talk?
Yes.
Right. Okay, so Judy, what is that like? Do you find it distracting or do you find it comforting? Oh, you're muted still. I'm going to unmute you. There you go. Judy, you should be able to speak and be heard.
Okay. I was brought up in a conservative synagogue, and people were always milling around. The men were always milling around. You didn't see women milling around, but the men did. I suppose it would be distracting, but I was used to it, so it wasn't distracting.
Right. Thank you. You just encapsulated the whole thing. I suppose I would find it distracting, but I was raised in it, so it wasn't distracting. When people who have only ever been to Reform services go to their first Orthodox service, most of them find it extremely jarring. How do you focus on the prayers? There's no organ playing along. There's no piano keeping everybody on the same page. The people are, they're moving around. They're davening at different paces. They're not in the same key. These three guys were walking up and down the aisles, schmoozing me. While I was trying to say the Shema, somebody else came up to me and asked if I wanted an aliyah for the Torah. Somebody else asked if I could make a minyan this afternoon. And then I heard somebody else talking about the score of the ball game. Right? That's an Orthodox service. Similarly, if you've only ever been to Orthodox services and you go to your first Reform service, generally you can't stand it. It's so rigid. Where's all the side conversation? Where are all the interruptions? This is supposed to be public. It's supposed to be social. And I think what's fascinating is that these dynamics were in place at the time of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is basically saying we understand that gathering in, and I know that this is poignant and a bit painful for me to be talking about all of these norms of prayer that can't exist the way they used to when we are quarantined each in our own homes and doing prayer on Zoom. That's a disclaimer. But you remember what it was like to pray in shul, do you not? For the Mishnah, that balance between, well, how much am I allowed to greet my peers? How do I know if it's appropriate to stop davening for 2 seconds to say Shabbat Shalom to somebody I recognize? All of these dynamics are in the Mishnah. Ellen Bittner, you have a hand up. My dad, Doug, has a hand up. And let's take Ellen first.
I was just going to comment that I've been to Orthodox services where, of course, the women are separate. And there was actually someone who was appointed to go around and be the shusher.
Yes. Or as we call it in, my dad has this name for it. I doubt it's original to our household, but the Hesadander, right? Hey, sit down there, right? The guy who walks around, or the person who walks around shushing everyone is the Hesadander. So, Dad, you want to jump in on that?
I like that as well. And perhaps you could recall what it was like at Rabbi Judah's congregation in Bethlehem, which I guess we could describe as conservadox. I remember in response to the fact that children would come up to a book cart and take books back, and there was a very adherent to Jewish tradition, but also a rather informal atmosphere that they said, synagogue should be like being in your family. And he said, the more this is like a living room to my congregations, the better I like it.
There's a comment in the chat window that corroborates that perspective. Children running in and out and people walking around the bima. Yeah, that's normative in many Jewish settings, particularly in Orthodox conservative denominations. And in those settings, it's actually, I guess the right word in Yiddish would be, it's Hamish, right? It's nice.
Yes.
Alan Markowitz wrote to me a private note that I'm going to share publicly because I think it's great. He says, milling around is different than small talk. Agreed. Either way, right before the Amida, everyone, in all caps, knows to pay attention, sometimes commencing with a clop on the reading table. Yes, there are all sorts of informal traditions around how you get people's attention, and there is a difference between the warm-up prayers, we talked about those last week, the prayers that are even before Baruch Hu et Adonai Barach, before the Shema, during Shema, and then before the Amida, there's more of a sense of keva. Let's stick to the keva, folks. Now's not the time just to schmooze. Okay. So all I want you to see is that the norms that are being discussed, tossed around, entertained here in the Mishnah this is not just some abstract, arcane book of rules. No, this is a building block of Jewish life. And so much about what Jews think and do, even now, even today, is embedded in the Mishnah. You see it here. So I think we have time for at least another Mishnah. Okay. Now this I'm not going to, we're definitely going to skim this one and get to some of the meatier stuff. These are the breaks between the sections. Remember how I said that you don't need to know the breaks between the sections? Okay, the rabbis want you to know the breaks between the sections. Between the first blessing and the second, so that's, if it's an evening service, that's between the Ma'ariv blessing and Ahavat Olam. Between the second blessing, between Ahavat Olam and Shema. Between Shema and V'haya im shamoa tishma'u, that's the second paragraph of the Shema, the one about the rain falling. Between that paragraph and Vayomer Adonai, which is the one about the tzitzit, and between the last paragraph of the Shema, or the Ve'ahavta, Vayomer Adonai, the tzitzit paragraph, and Emet V'yatziv, which is the paragraph right after the Shema. In other words, each paragraph represents, in between each paragraph, you get a little break, where it would be appropriate to greet somebody even just out of respect or return a greeting. If you're in the middle of davening a line, wait till you get to the end of the paragraph, please. That's the idea. Rabbi Judah says you really shouldn't interrupt between the end of the Ve'ahavta, or the end of the Shema, and the next paragraph. The reason is because, remember how the Ve'ahavta ends? Leman tizkeru v'asitem et kol mitzvotai v'item kedoshim. Oops, that's not it. Leloechem. Ahani Adonai Elohechem Asher Hotzeiti Etchem Me'eretz Mitzrayim. Here we are. Liot lachem lelohim Ani Adonai Elohechem. So the last line of the Shema is Ani Adonai Elohechem. I am Adonai your God. When you go, the very next prayer, this is the Reform Movement prayer book that's now up on the screen. Nope, didn't want to do that. No, never mind. I'm going to cancel that tab because I lost it. The very next prayer after the end of the Shema starts with the word emet. Emet means truth or true. When you say the last line of the Shema, Ani Adonai Elohechem, and then you say the word emet, you've created a new phrase, Adonai Elohechem emet, which happens to be another verse from the book of Jeremiah. We're just having fun here. We're just playing games with the scripture. In other words, you've got this line from Deuteronomy, Ani Adonai Elohechem. You've got a prayer that starts with the word emet. You mush them together and you get Ani Adonai Elohechem emet. Adonai Elohechem emet is Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 1, or something like that. I'm probably quoting wrong. The rabbis love doing stuff like this. They loved embedding little, are you familiar with the term Easter eggs? So this would be, I think that anyone of the millennial generation knows what an Easter egg is. An Easter egg is when a computer programmer programs in a hidden little fun thing that the gamer can find while playing. This started, by the way, back in the late 70s with the first Atari games. The programmers of those games would build in little Easter eggs. Like if you just happened to click on this little pixel at just the right time, a secret chamber would open and you'd find an extra treasure. Video games are full of Easter eggs. Movies are also full of Easter eggs. Things that you have to watch for, and only if you know they're there will you see them. Little hints, little tidbits, little treats. So this is what we call, in modern parlance, this is an anachronism with respect to the Mishnah, this is an Easter egg. If you combine these prayers in just the right way, you get a new verse that wasn't there before. I can tell you're fascinated by this. Okay, I'm going to move on. Rabbi Judah says, okay, you don't interrupt in order to create that Easter egg. Rabbi Joshua ben Korcha said, why was the section of the Shema placed before that of, and it shall come to pass if you listen? Okay, so now we're back to why are the paragraphs of the Shema in this order? Why is it Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad first, then and Ve'ahavta, then the paragraph about, and if you observe all the mitzvot, God will reward you, and if you do not observe the mitzvot, God will not reward you, and finally the passage about the tzitzit. The Mishnah says, so that one should first accept upon himself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, and then take upon himself the yoke of the commandments. This is now the second time in today's lesson that I've used the word yoke. You recall, about an hour ago, I said, accept the yoke, and not like Y-O-L-K, not the yolk of an egg, Y-O-K-E. A yoke is what is put on a beast of burden in order to carry the plow, right? You affix a yoke to an ox so that it can till your fields. The Hebrew word for yoke is this guy here. This word where my hand is, can you see it? Ol. Ayin lamed, with the vowel that makes the O sound. Ol. And ol is a yoke, Y-O-K-E. The rabbis describe the recitation of the Shema as Kabbalat ol malchut, this word here, Shemayim. Kabbalat means receiving or accepting, like Kabbalat Shabbat, receiving Shabbat. Kabbalat panim at a wedding, receiving faces. That's the little shmooze greeting time before you walk under the chuppah. Lechadodi likrat kala, come, O beloved, to greet the bride. Penei Shabbat nikabbalah. Let us greet or welcome or accept, receive the face of the Sabbath. Okay? Kabbalat, ol, the yoke, malchut, from melech, the kingdom, Shemayim, of the heavens, or of God. In other words, the Shema is the way in which the Jew affirms his or her faith in God. That is why you recite the Shema when you lie down, when you rise up. It's also why you recite the Shema on your deathbed. It's a declaration of faith. It is the Jewish article of faith, and it's really our only universally agreed upon article of faith. So the rabbis are saying, why does the Shema paragraph come before the paragraph about doing the mitzvot? Because first, the Jew must accept the yoke on his shoulders. I'm using gendered language, forgive me. He must accept the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. In other words, he accepts that he is a supplicant before God, that God is the sovereign and that he is the supplicant. Submission. Why do we bow on Baruch? It's the same thing. You accept the yoke of heaven upon you, or the yoke of God, and only then do you accept the yoke of the mitzvot. And it uses the same word in the next line. Ve'achar kach, meaning, and after that, yikabel alav ol mitzvot. And after that, he can accept, kabel alav, on him, ol mitzvot, the yoke of the mitzvahs. First, you believe in God, then you accept the mitzvot. By the way, this is, you must say, well, of course, that's intuitive, but it's not. Because how many times have you heard people, including me, say that Judaism is a religion of deed before creed? There are plenty of other places in the rabbinic literature that say, no, do the mitzvot first, and belief in God will come. The premise, at least, of this Mishnah is the opposite. You say, I believe, I profess my submission before God, I profess that the yoke of the kingdom of heaven is on me, and then I'm ready to accept the mitzvot. And that sequence of yoking oneself to the tradition informs the order of prayers in the Shema. I'll finish the paragraph and then there'll be time for questions. Why does the section, if you shall come to pass, come before that of and the Lord said? Because, and it shall come to pass if you listen, is customary during both day and night, whereas the section and the Lord said is customary only during the day. So now we're actually talking about the last two paragraphs. Why does this paragraph, the one about the mitzvot, and if you do God's mitzvot, God will reward you. If you don't, God will punish you, come before the passage about the tzitzit? This rabbi says, well, it's because this one is recited both morning and night, which means you always do it. This one only by day. By the way, that is no longer the case. We recite both of them at night. But why would you recite the passage about tzitzit only in the morning?
Because you can see it.
Because you can see it. And what is the custom around wearing a talis at shul?
Wear it in the morning.
Only in the morning. Talit is worn only in the morning. In part because your tzitzit are your clock for knowing when it's dawn. and they serve no utility after dark. The blue and the white thread can't be distinguished when it's dark out. But the bigger point is that in Jewish tradition, you only wear a tallis to morning services. There is an exception to that rule, of course. When does one wear a tallis at night?
Only Drake.
Onidre. So now you know all the rules around wearing a tallis. And remember how I said on our very first class a few weeks ago, the Mishnah, as detailed as it is, still assumes a highly educated reader. It just assumes that the reader already knows this stuff. So yeah, you've got your tallis, you only wear it in the morning, so you should only have to recite the passage about the tzitzit in the morning. And it would be easier to have that at the end of the page rather than in the middle of the page, because it's hard to skip over a middle paragraph, whereas it's very easy to skip an end paragraph if you're only doing it once a day as opposed to twice a day. Did that make sense, what I just said? Okay. I know this requires a kind of attention to detail. Okay, a couple questions in the chat box. So of first importance to the rabbis was establishing new practices and processes to create norms to replace temple rules. Yeah, exactly. I don't know if they were establishing new practices so much as they were consolidating, articulating, defining, describing, explaining, and fixing practices that were already well known within the Jewish community. Michelle, I take issue only with the verb establishing. I think that there's very little that the Mishnah does to establish practices that weren't already commonplace. And what I just said about the assumed knowledge of the reader corroborates that perspective. Yeah, nuns wear yokes. Right, there's the priestly collar is actually a yoke. It's a sign of that you have yoked yourself to God. So nuns and priests in the Catholic tradition, the clerical collar is also a similar sign. Why something around the neck? Because it's a yoke. Some people seem to wear their tallis at all services. Yes, they do. It is always acceptable for the service leader to wear a tallis. Also, if there is a Torah reading, whether it is morning, afternoon, or evening, the Torah reader or a person with an aliyah to the Torah can wear a tallis. But technically, you're not supposed to wear a tallis in the afternoon or evening, only in the morning. All right, we're going to do one more. Hooray. We have time for it, and then I'm going to end class. All right, we're already getting through chapter 2. I love this Mishnah. Starting in Hebrew, HaKorei et Shema velo hishmiya laozno. So one who reads the Shema, recites the Shema, but does not hear it, hishmiya, from Shema. You see it? Shema, right there. Leozno, in his ear. So if you're saying the Shema, but you don't hear it, so what are we talking about? We're talking about what in Italian is called sottovoce, or a mumble, or a whisper, or an undertone, or maybe even you're just mouthing the words. But if you're saying the Shema, but so quietly that you can't even hear, your own ears can't hear you saying it, Yatsa. This word here, Yatsa, is a very important word in the Mishnah. So I'm going to digress for a couple of minutes on Yatsa, because you need to understand this concept to get deep into Mishnah. First, a word about the word. Yatsa. Everyone sees the word I've highlighted. I made it super big. Yud Tzadi Aleph. Yatsa literally means to go out. It's the same word as Yitziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt. It's the same root as Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz, which means, we praise you, God, Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz. Does anyone know how to translate Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz? Not a rhetorical question. Who brings out bread from the earth. Yatsa means to go out or exit. If you are in a public room, a public building in Israel, like a movie theater, there will be an illuminated sign at the front of the room by the door that says Yitziyah, exit. It's the same word as Exodus, by the way. So if you're a Jew, if you're an Israeli and you see the word at the front of the room, it looks exactly like Exodus. Yitziyah, leave, exit. One who reads the Shema but can't even hear the words in his ears, yatsa. He exits. What does that mean? What is he going out from?
The responsibility to do the mitzvah?
Exactly.
Intention.
Right. Or it's even more than intention. He is released. Think of the word release. He is released of the obligation to perform the mitzvah. In other words, he did it. I use this word all the time with my staff, with Kelly. We've adopted this as colloquial parlance in the Blake household. Yotze is the present tense form of yatsa. Yatsa means he has fulfilled. Yotze just means one is released of an obligation. Okay, example from real life. Somebody called and left me a birthday message. I call back, but I don't get through. I say thank you on his voicemail. Let's say that I'm really interested in letting this person know that I deeply appreciate the birthday greeting. So I call back again, and I still don't get through. And then I send a text message that says, hey, Mike, just wanted you to know how much your birthday message meant to me. At that point, I'm Yotze, all right? I have fulfilled my obligation to say thank you for something nice. I don't have to call him every day until I actually reach him. Right? There are certain just etiquettes in public life where we understand that if you try hard enough or if your intention was good, you're Yotze. You don't have to do more to prove that you really did the thing you said you were going to do. And again, we're in the Yotze functions because you need to understand how Jewish life turns on dynamics of both action and intention. And there are times when we have to ask the question, well, when is the intention alone sufficient to release a person from the obligation to do a mitzvah? If I wanted to give tzedakah, okay, and I have the money in my bank account, but for whatever reason, I drag my heels, I procrastinate, and I end up just texting somebody who belongs to the organization, I think you're doing great work. Am I Yotze because I kind of feel nice about this organization? Of course not. You're not Yotze to give tzedakah till you actually give tzedakah. But there may be times where I write a check to tzedakah, it gets lost in the mail, it never gets received. Now you're asking a different question. Have I completed my obligation to give tzedakah if it can't be processed? All right, so and these are all hypotheticals. I'm just saying how the concept works. So this is a provocative notion that if you say the Shema, but so quietly that your own ears can't hear it, you, according to this tradition, are Yotze. You've fulfilled your obligation, but of course the Mishnah won't let that just stand. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Rabbi Yossi says he has not fulfilled his obligation. He is not Yotze. Lo yatsa. See up here? Right here. Lo yatsa. He is not released. He does not go out. He's still obligated to do it. If I said Shema like this, so quietly I can't even hear myself, Rabbi Yossi says, no, Blakey, you got to go back and say it loud enough for at least you to hear that you said it. If he recited it without pronouncing the letters succinctly, that is a mistake. The word is not succinctly, it's distinctly. The Hebrew is dikdek. Dikdek literally means grammar. So if he said all of the letters distinctly, if he did not say all the letters distinctly, if he just kind of said, like just kind of mumbled it, Rabbi Yossi says he has fulfilled his obligation. So the same guy who said you have to say it out loud in order to fulfill his obligation is willing to concede that even if you mumble it indistinctly, that will count. But Rabbi Judah, who's even stricter than Rabbi Yossi, comes along and he says, no, not enough. Now we're on to a different subject. If you recite it out of order, he has not fulfilled his obligation. So if you start with Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha Shema Yisrael, no, that is not how it goes. You got to do the paragraphs in their order. There's a seder for things. You don't start with Aleinu and then go to the Amida and then do your warm-up prayers. You got to do it in the right order. If he recites it, and there's no argument around that, by the way. You notice that no rabbi comes along and says, no, I think that's okay. Everyone agrees. And if he recites it and makes a mistake, he goes back to the place where he made the mistake. Very important concept in Jewish life. And this is true for Torah reading as well. If you're praying and you bobble a word, you just go back and do it again. So now you know everything. And we're going to spend the remaining 2 or 3 minutes on comments or questions. Somebody has commented, this is Russell, am I the only one who finds the imagery of a yoke disturbing? Laws, and this is Russell's a lawyer, laws are, quote, the wise restraints that make us free. You're going to have to tell us, Russell, to whom we should attribute that quote. But that is not the same as a yoke, which inhibits our ability to choose and deprives us of movement. Well, I can't answer that question. Only your classmates can answer whether or not you are the only one who finds the imagery of a yoke disturbing. So Russell, would you, if you would like to elaborate and also attribute the quote, you can do so at this time.
I don't know who said it.
Great. Well, look, that's your homework. Mine is to look up the asterisks.
It is a chestnut that is bandied about, and I think it is at best, well, it's at least a rationalization, but. No, my question, the image of a yoke implies that we are beasts of burden. And that means that we have no ability to make choices when Deuteronomy, the very section of, the very book of the Torah that gives rise to all of this, tells us that we are given choices and we are directed to choose the right things. Life is not something breathed into us, but it's something, life is the choices we make. How are the two consistent?
Wonderful. Of course, I'm going to choose not to answer that question. Though I will repeat what Michelle wrote in response to you, which is that the yoke imagery might imply that being Jewish is a voluntary obligation. No, and I think that's consistent with the word of the Mishnah itself, which basically says you must accept the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. That is what reciting Shema means. It means that you willingly accept being subservient to these obligations. Nothing else works unless you understand, nothing else works in the Mishnah unless you understand the concept of obligation. Now, I suppose that obligation has a little bit of, fluidity around, well, how obligated are we? Is it our own choice? Is it imposed? These could lead to a very productive discussion for which we don't have the time today. But I think that the Reform movement wrestles with this, by the way. And as a Reform Jew, I wrestle with this, not even as a Reform rabbi. I have an ambivalent relationship with the obligatory dimension of mitzvot. Is it all just choice? Or are there some things that incontrovertibly even a Reform Jew should think of as incumbent on the Jew, on the practitioner, on the supplicant? I don't know.
May I just add one gloss to that? And that is, it may be that the choice that Deuteronomy asks us to make when they say choose life if you would live is to choose the yoke. Is that really the only choice we make? Or are there lots and lots of choices that follow? And it sounds to me as if there are not. According to this, you make that one choice and the rest is just rote.
I love that. I also appreciate Steve Maskett, who, like the kid in 9th grade that I didn't even have to pay, managed to do my homework for me. He said in the Art Scroll Siddur, the asterisks indicate that there is commentary to be referenced in the Siddur. The asterisks, however, are not the same as the one that I showed. So I'll do my homework, but you might be right, Steve, that they are simply somebody has something to say about that line. The yoke is a way of harnessing energy of the sacred to accomplish mitzvot. Beautiful. Yeah, yoke, Y-O-K-E. The yoke, Y-O-L-K, is simply nutritious breakfast. So it's all good.
Sorry.
It's all good. It's the kind of wordplay that the rabbis themselves would have loved. And so as for this rabbi, where does that leave us? I think it leaves us in a wonderful place for reflection on this Tisha B'Av. we've really moved away from only understanding the mechanics of prayer. We're moving outward from mastering the mechanics of our prayer to all of the other dimensions of the spiritual life that go into having a successful or rewarding prayer experience. And those include, what does it mean to pray in community when other people are walking by and interrupting you all the time? What does it mean to direct one's heart? How do we accommodate people in the community who maybe can't pronounce the words? Michelle Braun made a very, I think, trenchant observation about Rabbi Yossi now going on the record, allowing somebody with a speech impediment to still fulfill the obligation, which I think it's a really important remark for our times to understand. We're talking a lot about prayer as obligation versus invitation. So, again, the Mishnah isn't here Mishnah's not a code of laws. It's not just here to tell you, here's how you do it, don't ask questions. The Mishnah is a building block of Jewish life. And everything we think about as Jews today finds its expression in this wonderful book. So thank you for studying with us. The class has been recorded and will be distributed electronically. Next week, we resume and we pick up with where you can say the Shema. Can you say it on top of a tree or in a cherry picker in your backyard? And why? Okay, but that's a teaser for next week. Have a wonderful week. I've enjoyed studying with you. There's no greeting on Tisha B'Av unless you're fasting, in which case I wish you a Tzom Kal, an easy fast. Even more, have a comforting after Tisha B'Av. And join me on Friday night for services at 6:15. And join me again on Saturday morning where I'll be leading Torah study on this week's Parsha. And in addition to looking at the Shema, we're also going to tackle questions around annexation, which are both in this week's Torah portion with respect to the conquest of the Promised Land, as well as in the contemporary discourse around Israel and the Palestinian territories. So really, really a lot for us to do this week. See you soon.
Yasher Kolah, Rabbi.
Baruch Tiyeh. Bye, guys.
Thank you.